Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you today. And I'm very much looking forward to taking you through some of the work that we've been doing and some of the analysis that we currently have of where the very important manufacturing sector is sitting at the moment. My name is Ben Fletcher, and I am responsible within Make UK for our policy work and our political engagement and also our membership teams. And what I'm going to do is just open up with just a few of the sort of key political insights that we have at the moment. And then I will hand over to my colleague James, who will take you through the detail of the data. I think without being unnecessarily pessimistic, we are at a really critical juncture for the manufacturing industry in the UK at the moment. And I think some of the decisions that will be taken today by the Prime Minister, some of the decisions that will be taken by the government over the next few weeks on COVID and COVID response are going to play out in the context of some equally vital decisions that will be taken by the government in regard to our position on further negotiations with the European Union, on leaving the transition period at the end of the year, and whether or not we're leaving with a free trade agreement or whether we're leaving without one. And I think that those things are incredibly vital for both setting the context, but also for explaining the mood of manufacturers at the moment. With regard to COVID, we have had an exceptionally challenging year, as have many other sectors. What we're experiencing is a very wide spectrum of responses, but a real underpinning, I think, of confidence that is very, very fragile in some sectors, particularly aviation and automotive. A real nervousness about empty order books, and we will have more data on that later. But I think a real concern that actually we're not through the worst of it, and a real sense that it's going to take a very long period of time for confidence and the economy to recover properly. And in particular, our lobbying and our political engagement at the moment is very much focused, and today's announcements are likely to accentuate this, that if we have a cliff edge end to the job retention scheme, particularly in those sectors where demand and confidence are so fragile, we will experience a really, really challenging environment around redundancies and the wider economy. And part of the service that Make UK offers to members, as well as its policy work and some of the other things we do, is a human resources legal service to some of our members. And it would be fair to say, without breaching any client confidentiality, that the demand that service is facing at the moment is greater now than it was even at the height of the financial crisis 12 years ago. And the majority of the inquiries we're receiving are about handling redundancies. So it gives you a sense of the challenge in the sector. We're also incredibly focused on the incredibly febrile and challenging negotiations about leaving the European Union. And it's worth saying that some of the debate in Parliament today about COVID is actually directly related to the challenge that a government that had an 80-seat majority and won an election just a few months ago is now under huge pressure with an incredibly angry set of backbenchers, an incredibly frustrated set of backbenchers. And the government has got to get the internal markets bill through the House over the next few weeks. It's currently in committee stage. Some of you may have seen the previous Prime Minister, Theresa May's intervention last night in the House, indicating that she couldn't support the bill as it was currently drafted. That is permeating, and that issue is permeating into today's announcement on COVID, and the mood of the backbenchers, the nervousness that Number 10 have about a possible rebellion, and the embarrassment of losing a vote with an 80-seat majority is bringing both of those issues into sharp relief, and is also underlying some of the political challenges. What we're acutely aware of is that all of this is delaying the point at which manufacturers will have any degree of certainty about the operating environment that they'll be in now in just around 100 days. And many people who say that there's a marginal difference between a free trade agreement and leaving without a deal, that may be true, and many would disagree with me, that may be true in the service economy, but it really isn't true in manufacturing. There is even a very slim free trade agreement makes a world of difference to manufacturers. And there are a number of areas where that's particularly acute, but in particular, it's relevant to tariffs. And without picking unfairly on the automotive sector, in the UK, we are a very, very significant volume producer of cars within Europe. The vast majority of the cars that are made in the UK are exported to Europe. To give you an indication of the scale, one large factory in the northeast makes more cars than the entire Italian car industry, and that's just one plant, a very sizable plant, but one plant nonetheless. The likely tariff to the car industry, if we don't get a trade agreement, would be 10%, and the profit margin is between 4 and 7%, 3 and 7% in some cases. So the entire export base of the car industry starts to become unviable if we don't get a trade agreement. So that challenge of the next few months and giving certainty, as well as all the issues around customs, a customs border that might be brought back to the M25, the complexities of moving goods, that's another reason why this is a particularly challenging period of time. And why we're looking and why we're focused on that issue of confidence and certainty is that businesses need some of that certainty to be able to invest, to make decisions, to know whether they can gamble with taking people off furlough and keeping their jobs because they have a slightly more promising outlook for the new year, or whether or not actually the picture for the new year continues and possibly gets more challenging. What we're also acutely aware of, having just done a big round of engagement with members, is that actually, despite everyone's best efforts, people aren't prepared. There continues to be a real challenge. There is a fatigue in all sectors, I think. It's particularly acute in manufacturing. And that ability, both financially and just in terms of bandwidth to prepare for a very different trading environment in January, has become very, very visible. So it's a very, very challenging period of time. It's a very, very demanding period of time. We're very confident that the manufacturing sector will bounce back. We're very confident that the capabilities and the skills within the sector are very strong and ultimately very resilient. But we're very, very conscious that there is a war that's being fought on two fronts at the moment by our members, and that's both dealing with a major pandemic and the operating restrictions that they face, and also preparing for a very, very significant change in trading environment. And just to finish and to bring that home, if you're not already aware, manufacturing is about 12% of the economy. It's arguably greater than that if you also take into account those other sectors that are dependent on it. But despite being 12% of the economy, it produces almost half of the country's exports. And of those, almost half of them go to the EU. So understanding that issue about the dynamic and the context over the next few months and how a sizable change will affect that really is very, very stark when you consider both how much our export base depends on manufacturers and how much of that is about trade with the EU. That was the kind of high-level overview. I will now hand over to my colleague James, one of our senior economists, who can take you through the data that we've produced at this stage of the manufacturing outlook process.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. What I'll do just before I get into this third quarter's research is just set a little bit of the scene for Q1 and Q2 so we know where Q3, what I'm going to present to you today, and where that sits. So our Q1 research window came just before the pandemic really hit industry here in the UK. And it was, in essence, almost like a snapshot of the industry just before it went into the pandemic. And already then in Q1, it wasn't a massive growth phase or a particularly positive moment in that quarter. In Q2, we saw the depths of the pandemic and it's the havoc it wreaked on industry. And in Q3 now, what we'll see is an inkling of growth and a silver lining, however, nowhere near to the degree that could be called a quick V-shaped recovery. And we'd be looking at a far longer recovery process into Q4 and almost certainly into the start of 2021 as well. So an overview, as you see on your screen here, of this quarter's research is that a lot of the key metrics have improved or got less worse, shall we say, than the previous quarter, because in many instances they're still negative balances. However, last quarter they were record-breaking, and in the 30-year history of this research, these were the worst levels recorded ever for output and orders. Export orders is slightly outperforming domestic orders, and this is largely because of phased market reopenings happening faster in the East than they are currently in the West. But we expect that lag effect to change over into Q4. A big story is that expectations for the fourth quarter of this year are looking up. So manufacturers are starting to acknowledge within their own businesses that although Q2 was the depth of it, Q3 hasn't been as quick as a recovery that might have been hoped, but the expectations for Q4 are that that's going to really start to improve. Another large takeaway from this is that firms, despite the job retention scheme not having fully wound down yet, redundancies are already skyrocketing. And so we're seeing firms over the past few months have taken action to cut their wage bill before the furlough scheme has finished. However, when that furlough scheme does finish, we do expect a rush and the floodgate to open on unemployment further than it already has. Our manufacturing output forecast, as it currently stands, is at just under minus 11% for 2020, and our UK GDP forecast is at minus 8.5% for 2020. However, with both these forecasts, they are due to change due to the changing circumstance and dynamic nature of the situation that the UK economy finds itself in, and particularly relevant due to any potential second wave or second national lockdown that may or may not be on the horizon. Now I'll take you into some sort of in-depth look at some of these metrics. So if I could get the next slide, please. Lovely. So here's our time series of some recent years on output and orders, just to give you a bit of context as well. On the far right, you'll see we put a ghost bar in of the global financial crisis. So we can see in 2020 Q2 on the right-hand side of the screen there, we just pipped it. And in relative change in 2020 Q3, we've come quite away from that in terms of an improvement. However, we've got to be careful not to call it an outright improvement, because really it's less negative and it's not really outright growth. So what we can say is that as the firms that responded to this research, at least less of them are doing the same or not as worse. So we can't really go with outright recovery at this point. Also, this quarter's survey covers a portion of the period of total lockdown during the month of May, of which many manufacturers continue to operate anyway, but witnessed their orders dissipate regardless. But also this survey period includes the months where total lockdown restrictions were eased in the UK as well as overseas. And so a lot of partial activity resumed during this time, and hence why we're seeing that uptick from Q2. Following the abysmal results of last quarter as well, the order balance improved in line with output balance to minus 40%. And although these figures indicate an overall contraction in the industry, they do remain in this quarter negative in respect to the total 30-year, what we've seen in the past, over the past 30 years in this research's history. I'll talk a bit about the export performance now on the next slide, please. And export orders reported a balance of minus 34%, which is a marked improvement over Q2's 2020's minus 52%, as is reflected in the bars here. And we've also got the same global financial crisis ghost bar, so we can get a bit of context to what the depth of these negative metrics mean. But regardless of how trade negotiations progress, the COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly raised concerns of the trade weaknesses that don't necessarily pertain to the trade agreements or discussions there within. And particularly this is in respect to the flow of goods through supply chains, and in terms of losing access to key components, and especially in highly integrated supply chains and international integration in those supply chains, where there might not be any other alternatives. We've seen freight, logistics, and general foreign supply issues really cause serious issues for domestic production lines in the UK. And for example, during the early days of the pandemic, the automotive sector in particular demonstrated these issues as OEMs were infamously unable to source these components from countries including Italy and China, as their own productions had taken such a hit. What we are seeing, though, is that export orders are slightly leading over domestic orders here in terms of the uptick. And this is largely due to that phased market opening I was talking about, as in the Eastern markets are should we say, a bit further along their COVID process, and so they're far further into their recovery as the pandemic has swept west. And in the Western markets, we're far more in the midst of it, shall I say. And so I'll talk about demand conditions in a moment, but we've seen improving demand conditions from the East as opposed to the West for the first time in a long time as well. I'll talk a little about some sectors now, thank you. So this latest third quarter research reports similar trends for individual subsectors, although the results, as is evident, remains mixed. Basic metals reported a shockingly worse minus 75% output balance following last quarter's minus 5%. Metal products output balance improved to minus 19% from minus 48%. And this is largely as activity returns to a number of key downstream sectors such as automotive and construction, although they're still far out the dark, with the lockdown being eased and then activity really starting to return in earnest in the economy. It's expected that these subsectors will continue to see some further recovery and return of activity in the sector. The mechanical subsectors, and such as machinery equipment and also electrical equipment and electronics, all reported an improvement in the output balance similar to the UK average. However, as is a bit of a trend, all remain in negative territory still, and this indicates a lack of demand for these advanced technologies and high levels of capital investment that aren't being filtered through down into these subsectors. But nevertheless, the forecasts for the next 3 months are generally more positive from the manufacturers themselves. As well, rubber and plastics also reported an improved balance of minus 15% this quarter, although still negative. And the sector has observed mixed outcomes. Rubber firms continue to struggle as a result of weak demand, and particularly as a result as that so much of the rubber subsector in the UK is actually made up of the tyre market. And due to very, very poor performance in terms of new car registrations this year, as big ticket purchasing has been pushed down as of the sort of societal impacts and economic societal impacts of the pandemic, we're seeing the rubber sector hit in that regard. Plastic goods have seen an increase in output, a sort of short-term spike in demand due to many plastic firms repurposing production into PP production and plastic packaging and other such related interventions. And we expect this demand to continue for at least a few quarters as the world sort of adjusts to the new normal. And we expect this PPE requirement and new plastics requirement to go about our daily lives to continue for at least a couple of quarters. Now I'll talk about those demand conditions on the next slide, if you would. Thank you. So yes, as expected, and as well known, the EU remains the top market for the UK, as it does every quarter. But interestingly, this quarter, manufacturers reported improved demand conditions in Asia more so than North America. Now, we would normally typically see North America as the leading demand condition for most of these manufacturing overall and also most of these subsectors. But as I alluded to before, this is primarily a reflection of the different stages of international market reopenings across the globe, as Eastern markets reduced lockdown restrictions earlier than Western markets due to the lag effect and the subsequent lag economic effects sweeping across the globe. On to the next slide, please. And this looks very similar to the first chart, but it just really hammers home what I wanted to say about expectations. And so what you're actually seeing here is the future quarter expectations. So every bar that you see is actually what is expected in the next quarter. So we see here in 2020 Q4, which is the next quarter, that is a huge expectation. And so this is when we do our research and we ask our businesses in the UK what their expectations are. So this is really from the horse's mouth, as it was. And generally, barring sudden economic shocks, such as the coronavirus pandemic, or shall we say the global financial crash, these tend to be a very, very strong indicator of the truth of what we'll hear when we do 2020 Q4's research. So this is a very positive indication about where the industry is heading in the fourth quarter of the year, although we perhaps might have expected less severe negativity in Q3, but nevertheless, this is a silver lining to look forward to in the following quarter. Talk a little bit prices and margin on the next slide. Lovely. Both domestic and international margins have been low for UK manufacturers for a number of consecutive quarters, and as a result, the impact of COVID-19 on profitability is not as directly obvious in a sector such as manufacturing that has already conformed to operating in tight margins, as Ben mentioned earlier about the automotive sector. However, nevertheless, the pandemic has still deep into this quarter's data. The latest survey, this in Q3, shows that our UK selling prices have remained flat despite low inflation, but export selling prices have fallen marginally by -3% on balance. As the order balances have indicated, UK margins have fallen over the last 3 months, but unfortunately, since the easing of lockdown and the implications of social distancing in the domestic market, we're yet to see any true sign of growth here. And some manufacturers have indicated an increase in their selling prices in order to recuperate greater funds with a lower number of sales. And conversely, export margins have improved somewhat in that same period, albeit enduring the same negative territory. But this does signify that international sales at the moment are returning before domestic ones. And on to the next slide about confidence. Now, this really goes in line with the output or the expectations that I showed you 2 slides ago. And what we have here is the orange line represents when people asked what they feel about the UK economy, and then the red line represents what people feel, manufacturers feel about their own personal business's performance. Now, there's always the personal business confidence always leads UK economic conditions because everyone thinks they're going to do better than everyone else. But so it's normal to see that. However, what we do see was a huge dip, especially in UK economic conditions in 2019 Q3, which was a result to the run-up to the threatened crash out of the EU at the end of 2019. And we see 2020 Q2 business confidence and UK economic conditions confidence collapsed amidst the depth of the pandemic. But we see now both of those ticking upwards. And all regions and nations, barring Scotland, reported a positive, albeit marginally positive business confidence this quarter. And so the inflection point here is at the 5 mark, which you can sort of roughly see along with your eye on the left. And so it's just marginally over 5 now, which implies even marginal positivity. And this tempered positivity reflects the UK's exit from the strictest of the lockdown measures, which created a very difficult operating environment for manufacturers in the UK. However, what we saw in last quarter and this quarter is that the grouping of these confidence values regionally across the country is much tighter than expected. And this is somewhat telling of the homogeneity of some of the operational challenges manufacturing businesses have faced throughout the country. And barring another UK-wide lockdown, which is very topical as of today, confidence would be expected to creep upwards in a similar vein to that of orders and output. On to the next slide, please. And I suppose this is really the crux of what I wanted to talk about today, because what we're seeing is a divergence. So we're seeing confidence starting to tick upwards, we're seeing output and orders starting to tick upwards, but we're seeing employment tick downwards, and we're seeing investment, most critically, investment continue to tick downwards. And the combination of these fundamentals of investment and employment figures cruising downwards, while output and orders look to be ticking upwards, creates a perfect storm, as it was, for a risk of an unsustainable recovery, in the sense that once that output and orders bubble, there won't be, in a medium-term view, talking 2, 3, 5 to 10 years, if investment isn't present to keep manufacturing processes productive, efficient, and also internationally competitive, that boost, that growth in orders and output won't be able to be maintained over the longer term. And especially with a continued bleed on jobs. But more concerning for both of these metrics really is that the manufacturer's future expectations for employment as well as investment, but particularly employment, in the final quarter of this year are still deeply negative, which warns of a continued bleed of jobs in the sector for the rest of the year. And this is understandable, given that when the JRS winds up, and we'll capture that period in our Q4 research, we do expect a deepening of those negative employment figures, the degree of which will depend on how much businesses have already cut their wage bill prior to the finishing of the furlough scheme. And next slide, please. And this is that investment time series plotted against output, just to sort of home in that point that we want to focus on, that we see output ticking upwards and investment going downwards, and that's a very worrying divergence for the future health of sustainable growth over the next few years, or sort of on a more medium-term view as opposed to the immediate quarterly view. And as the UK economy does take its first steps towards this recovery, and it shows that investment intentions are in fact even more negative than they were in the second quarter, which, as you can see there on Q2, which was the depth and the worst results ever reported for many other metrics, investment wasn't even as bad as it is in this quarter. So particularly worrying in that sense. Now, if we just skip over the next slide, which is just a summary slide that we can circulate later for some raw data, some regional stuff. So we skip over that. Yeah, lovely. Here's a summary of our forecast as it stands now, just graph of perspective, how it compares to our GDP forecast. As I mentioned at the start, minus 11% for manufacturing, so a more severe and harder hit than the UK average overall, and also followed from that low point by a slower recovery. So we're not expecting that sudden V in the manufacturing sector, largely not for the UK economy overall either, but definitely for it to lag behind the UK economy as we move into 2021, as manufacturing faces some very unique challenges specific to the sector with regards to spinning it, production back up, and the very capital intensive processes required to get back to business for industrial manufacturers. Now I'll move on to this last slide, which is identical to my first slide, just to review. But if there's really one key message to take away, is that we're seeing the key performance metrics such as output, orders, exports, ticking upwards or not being as bad as they were last quarter, and expectations looking quite positive for in terms of sense of recovery, but not outright growth in Q4. However, there is a large question mark about the sustainability of this short-term recovery, if it's if that investment underlying it is non-existent or even decreasing, and also with very tight cash flows, whether the business community and the manufacturing community even have access to that excess capital to be able to remedy that investment hole, even if they would like to. And I'll leave all that and hand it back to Baljeet.
Thank you, Ben and James. Really interesting update. So we'll pass over to Richard Austin for his update now.
Thanks, Bal. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Austin. I'm my partner at BDO, and I'm head of corporate advisory services. We spend a lot of time supporting clients in the manufacturing sector to improve performance, not only in current situations, but also in more positive situations in the past. If we can go on to the next slide, I'll kind of probably build slightly on what Ben was saying right at the beginning of the conversation. Around where we are in terms of manufacturing, but more broadly, how we apply our rethink model to the current situation as well. So I think Tim Foster brought this model up in the last quarterly presentation. But effectively, the way we see things is there are effectively three phases that all industries go through, and different industries will be at different stages on this journey. The initial react phase, which is very much when COVID kicked in, how to survive in that certain situation. Following through to kind of resilience, which is where we are now, which is a kind of what I would call a now normal, in terms of understanding how to run your operations in the current COVID environment. And hopefully when we come out is the other question, in terms of when we realise and come out the other side of that, in terms of returning to what I would call a new normal situation in the future. I think from the run through from Ben and James, that realise phase looks like it's getting pushed out to the right somewhat, especially for manufacturing. In terms of where we see the world at the moment, we're kind of effectively in that resilience phase. So we've moved on from react. If we can go back one slide, please, Bill, thanks. We've moved on from react. I think the other point that Ben made, which I would absolutely reiterate from what we're hearing on the ground at the moment, is manufacturing business are somewhat stable, but it's not sustainable. So you can survive, but it's a sort of steady decline rather than effectively sort of an improvement or a situation that you can sustain for any particularly long period of time. James also talked about that expectations of when we'll come out of things. We've always talked about V's, W's, U's, etc. I don't think there's a letter in the alphabet that will probably reflect the shape of what we're going to be going through. Otherwise, there'll be lots of zigzaggy bits with quite a few going downwards, I would think, over the shorter period before we start coming out of a curve towards the end. So it looks more like a sentence rather than a letter, I think is probably fair to say. The other point around this is that, and I think that's also reflected in what Ben and James are saying, is that I think we're almost at this tipping point now where there needs to be some quite hard decisions to be made. And I think that's reflected in the number of people reaching out to Make UK, talking about redundancies, etc. But the situation, as I said, isn't sustainable. And I think there'll be some hard decisions required within the manufacturing sector in the relative short term to be able to actually maintain a business more than succeed, I think is probably the most effective way of putting it. We can go on to the next slide, please, Belle. I think I've kind of covered this. I think Ben's picked up on it as well. But where we are right now is we've had a shutdown, re-emerging. There are back orders that are being filled. Forward order book visibility looks like it's somewhat improving, but that visibility going out in the longer term, I think, is very difficult to predict. Throw in with that compliance changes within government rules. There's uncertainty, and they seem to be changing on a relatively regular basis. Just leads to more things to think about in terms of the business. And then you throw in, I think what we picked up last time is around supply chain resilience. That's still absolutely critical for all manufacturing businesses. And being able to survive in the current situation does require coordination and work with a broader supply chain, whether it's in the UK or outside of the UK. I think one of the challenges there is that being able to change your supply chain in terms of its structure takes time. The question is, how much time have you got to be able to do that? But I think we've already talked about changes to government support. There's probably some announcement going on as we speak around that, I would suspect. But effectively, it feels like things they can maybe kick down the road, but it feels like, to build another example, it's like it's stretching a piece of elastic. You can only stretch it for a certain period of time, and it'll either have to bounce back or it'll snap. And I think it'd be interesting to see how long extensions to existing plans are in place, and also what might potentially replace them. And then, okay, let's throw on top of that potential of global recession. Let's throw on top Brexit uncertainty and a whole bunch of trade agreements, either positive or negative, regarding Japan, the US, you know, huge amount of confusion, frustration, which I think Ben's talked about, and fatigue. And if you roll all of that stuff up, you're looking at risk. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So one thing we've thought about is, well, what do you need to do to at least be able to plan for the future, whatever it may be? There's so much uncertainty out there. And wherever we are right now, and wherever we plan to be in the future, I think there's a need for a few things to think about. One is making sure you've got a short-term cash flow. I would hope that most people are already in that space already, just to understand what your cash position is, at least in the short term, almost on a daily basis. The second one is actually having a strategic plan. So if you need to change the business, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to change are there certain elements that you might want to make acquisitions? Are there certain elements of the business that you might need to downsize or increase? And flowing on from that is effectively an operations plan. So how do you put a strategy in place? Well, you need to have a proper operations plan to be able to deliver against that strategy. And in the longer term, really understanding what the options are and what the financial situation looks in the longer term as well. So looking at 12 to 24 months in terms of trading. In terms of what James is saying, that time frame seems the other side. Therefore, you should be thinking at that sort of time frame as well to understand how your business could potentially be trading. The important thing around that really is to make sure that you are able to make decisions in enough time without having to make them. It's having the time to be able to make decisions rationally without having to knee-jerk. And off the back of that, it's really that contingency planning piece, which is, well, what if that plan doesn't work? What do I do instead? Can we move to the next slide, please, Val? So if we kind of roll this up, I think it's messages in terms of top tips, probably build on what we talked about in the last quarter. So don't be surprised if you heard some of this stuff before. But firstly, scan the horizon, see what the opportunities and risks are out there in the future. Plan again. I can't remember who said it, but most people, I think somebody famous said that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But at least you have to have a plan in the first place to be able to understand whether you're on track or behind track. And with that is really establishing recovery scenarios, options, and stress testing them. So really understanding, well, what decision do I make if this happens? What do I do if that happens? How would I change my business? How might I potentially restructure my business in certain situations? Building on what I said before as well, is prioritizing and focusing. There's so much stuff going on at the moment, so many things to think about, that sometimes you can sit there with your head spinning, not working out what really matters. So it's absolutely critical to prioritize the things that you can do, things that you can influence, and work on those. There are certain things you can't influence. You need to be aware of them. You need to understand the implications of them, but you need to plan for the now. And building on that as well as also communicating effectively. And that's with suppliers, with customers, and probably most importantly with your employees as well, and shareholders. Actively manage risk. The other thing is that all businesses are different. All businesses are in different situations. So you can't compare a medical devices business to an aerospace engineering business. Everyone's plan is going to be different. Don't be surprised by that. You are specific businesses with specific risks and specific requirements. And finally, the last bullet is really around, if you need to do a transformation, if you've got to that tipping point, the recommendation there is, if you're going to do something, do it properly. If you're going to go all in and really deliver change when you need to. I've worked with a number of businesses where they've done it on a piecemeal basis, which is a recipe for a lot of pain in my experience. So if you're going to do a change, do it once and do it properly. So I think that kind of covers off the main points I wanted to pick up on. Bailey, who will talk about building our future and how we've applied the Rethink model to our business.
Thank you, Richard. And I'd like to start by saying I'm just going to go through a few slides that will hopefully bring Rethink to life for you in a practical way, because I think it'd be really inauthentic of us to talk about a model if we weren't actually using it ourselves as a business. And hopefully then bringing those top tips that Richard talked about to life. And I really liked what Richard said, actually, a sentence rather than a letter. And to me, that talks about fluidity rather than rigidity. And I think when we talk about a strategic framework, it has to be grounded in strategic context. And by that, I mean the external environment, what's happening globally, what's happening closer to home in the UK economy and our environment, what's happening with competitors, watching what our competitors are doing, and then thinking about ourselves as a business. So that strategic context is really critical when thinking about strategy. And at the moment, that is very agile and is moving and is very dynamic. So in terms of strategy, that needs to have that ability to flex to those different components. So if we move on to the next slide, Belle. So at BDO, we have a very clear strategic framework, which we brought into the business over 4 years ago. I'm going to bring this to life for you with a short boat analogy. So our purpose is why we get into the boat in the first place, why we even want to be as part of this business. Our vision is the destination that we are striving to get to, where we think good looks like, where we want to go. Our values are the behaviours that we display with each other on that journey to make it as enjoyable as possible. And our strategy is the journey that we're going to take, the decisions and the priorities that we've identified that we need to take to enable us to get to our vision, to that destination as quickly as possible. All of that is grounded in purpose. Purpose is the beginning of our strategic framework and has proved to be critical, I would say, in our response to the pandemic as a business. So our strategic framework, we've learned that it's best to keep it simple, but that structure needs to be agile enough to respond to circumstances as they do arise. So if we move on to the next slide. This, you'll recognise, is the rethink model, but this is how we've contextualised it internally within the business, and how we've used that to make our response relevant for our leaders and our people so that it becomes relatable. So as Richard was saying, in respect of that react during lockdown, we did a lot of things that most typical businesses would do. We looked at cash flow, and we managed that through a typical approach of scenario planning. Interestingly, scenario planning, being huge in the 80s, died a bit of a death and is now back with a vengeance. So I can imagine that you're all talking about scenario planning quite regularly, and it's a very helpful tool to manage that ambiguity. We looked at our workforce and thought, how can we ensure that we meet supply and demand? So what our clients really need with the skill sets that we have in the business. So we brought out an approach called FlexiForce, which won't just support us during that react phase, but will be critical in terms of our response during resilience and realise. We made sure that we had platform stability so that we could do these calls today and could communicate with each other and rely on the tech that we had in place. Critically, that we could service our clients and protect our business and people. And this is our core purpose, helping you succeed, coming to life. So again, this really grounded our decision making. We needed to make sure that we were being true to our purpose as a business. And then, as Richard mentioned, communication, just crucial. In terms of reaching out to our people, particularly in our new world of virtual working. So in respect to that, we're then moving on to thinking more about resilience and how we want to respond. What are the things that we're going to do now and in the longer term? So building that resilience through communication, understanding, personal responsibility, and team glue. So if we move on to the next slide. So these images help capture the fact that when we sat back and started to think about resilience, we wanted to prioritize what it is we wanted to do as a business. And we fairly quickly realized that actually it's harder to go back to where we were before than to move forward to realize new opportunities. And once we realized that, then we were galvanized to think about what sort of business do we want to create in the future and how are we going to move towards that. So if we move on to the next slide, Bal. So this is an internal slide which has brought that ambition together with our strategy and a number of internal strategic priorities that we had within the business. And this again is to communicate, to provide that clarity to the business as a whole, because I think when you're mobilized and working together, you're much more likely to achieve that success. So we call this a holistic approach and is critical in terms of just bringing it to life for our leaders and for our people. So if we were to read this slide very quickly, our response is very much grounded in our build strategy. So we have, our strategy is called build. It has 5 key elements: brand, unifying culture, international, leading markets, and digital mindset, which has provided great structure, but is broad enough for us to be able to adapt it to respond to the strategic context that I mentioned at the beginning. We then move from thinking about our strategy to how we're going to respond in the immediate react, resilience, and realize stages. And and in the grey are the priorities that we have within a business and how that fits in with that thinking and that model. And aligning everything helps to lead to greater collaboration, because people then understand what it is that we're trying to achieve and trying to achieve in the longer term. But what we have learnt is that we are going to have to work hard to retain and maintain those new ways of working. We're part of a fantastic member firm network globally, and learning from some of those countries that have loosened their lockdown far earlier than us and have returned much more to office-based working is actually those old habits that people create over a huge number of years come back very quickly when you go back into an environment that you're very familiar with. So actually ring fencing what might have benefited your business or evolved your business or enabled you to move forward is going to be important, because you'll need to then work hard, really hard, to maintain that. And then in terms of realise, so whilst juggling all the here and now and the turmoil and the uncertainty, it's important to keep an eye on the future, because the decisions that you make today will impact your business in the longer term. And Bal, if we move on to the final slide. So this is just bringing a very simple framework that we're using within the firm to life. These are just 10 questions that we're asking our business leaders. We're a complex matrix business. We have over 42 leaders that we work with in respect of their strategic plans, and asking these types of questions to get them to engage with the current and the future has been really helpful. In terms of contextualizing strategy, innovation and change. So just to bring 3 of these to life, the first one being risk management. Recognizing that as a business you'll have had a number of risks prior to C19, and how might those risks have shifted or adapted or changed in recent months is an important question to ask, because the more you address that, the more you're able to manage unknown unknowns now and in the future. If you move into the operational considerations and the question around technology, that brings about the question around what have we noticed might have been an enabler. So being able to actually do webinars such as this, reaching a huge number of people in different locations, has been an enabler. How might we want to preserve that as we move to the future? And then finally, on the right hand side, that collaboration piece. How are you going to continue to engage with your people, and particularly as we move to the future where there may be much more agile working, so managing people working in the office as well as working from home. So really very much I just wanted to get across the point that strategy is creative. Rethink is definitely a creative process. It is essential, and it's definitely essential in terms of helping your business navigate that uncertainty. It's not always easy, but modelling absolutely can help. But in my opinion, it's great fun. And on that note, I will hand over to Mark.
Okay, thank you, Zoe. Aware of time as well, so if people do have questions, it's worth getting those questions in now, and then we'll make sure that we have time to discuss those. But Bal, if you just pop on to the next slide. So Rich and Zoe both described that initial phase of the rethink model where lockdown takes place and we all react and have to make decisions really quickly. And it was really interesting to see how, as a profession, we reacted. Lots of legislation changing on a daily basis. And many of you will have experienced the furlough flyers, as every person under the sun decides that that's a great idea to ping out lots of information to all of their clients. Client care was a really important part of what took place at lockdown. So protecting staff was really important, but remembering to protect your suppliers and your customers was absolutely critical, particularly in the manufacturing sector. And in our approach, we basically use that time to not sell, but just to talk to our clients and listen to the challenges they're facing. And so just want to share a few bits and pieces coming out of that, particular to the manufacturing sector. And it's really encouraging because it aligns with everything that James and Ben were describing earlier on as well. It was always slightly worrying if it gave a different answer. But yes, from those conversations, the first one actually was productivity lessons. And it was really interesting. We've heard a lot of headlines about people being furloughed and how important that was, and it was. But actually, it was really interesting how many manufacturing businesses reported productivity improvements as they went through this. And I missed that as one of the questions that actually popped in. Interesting to see that businesses use that time to actually just rethink what they were actually doing and what was profitable, what was productive in terms of activity. And I think one of the reasons we're starting to see many businesses already addressing the redundancy topic, even though they are still, there is a level of furlough support, is because people have learned a lesson that actually they've identified what is productive and what's not. And so this is a chance for many of those businesses to make some of the tough decisions that they're having to make to build those strong and resilient businesses going forward. Supply chain, absolutely a major topic coming through, and again, that's being talked about. But the importance of monitoring and keeping close to your supply chain, some fantastic examples from businesses where they proactively reached out to their supply chain as being an important part of their business, whether that involved honouring payment terms, even flooding the supply chain to make sure there was funding through that supply chain to keep their own production continuing. But it was really important to look at that. The third point, though, that maybe though it would have been nicer to have heard more narrative about was the global footprint. Lots of challenges around how you get goods and how you sell. But one thing we've all learned is that actually we can do business with someone in New Zealand just as easily, not from a logistics point, but just as easily from a conversation point as someone who's just around the corner. And as the world suddenly moved to digital means of operating, probably surprised that there's not been more focus on that ability to reach out across the globe and reach into new markets that historically might have been prohibitive barriers. Talking to DIT at the moment, there's lots of talk about virtual trade missions. So in the past, where the cost of going on a trade mission might have been prohibitive or time consuming, actually now we can actually do a trade mission to anywhere in the world online and accelerate up some of those decisions needed to globalize the business. Acceleration of change, time and time again, people reporting that one thing that has happened from this whole pandemic has been an acceleration of change. Not necessarily a change of direction, but the things we knew were important have been emphasized as being important. So again, manufacturing businesses, it's hard to get out on site to do maintenance. It's hard to get out to service things. So stories of Internet of Things playing in and the ability to predictively monitor and maintain equipment to drive efficiencies and to provide that remote support definitely come to the forefront. And automation, the classic lean processes, businesses now saying, why did I have people manually packing things? Why did I have people manually processing things? Now let's get on board with automating as much as possible. So definitely going back to that productivity point, a massive drive to accelerate that change and automate how people are working. Workforce management, actually manufacturing more than anyone, they had to keep going. There wasn't an option not to keep going for manufacturing. And so some of the best examples of how businesses have protected their workforce coming out. But what was really encouraging was that was protecting at a human level. So yes, there's protecting and putting dispensers out and allowing people to wash their hands frequently. But actually talking to the business owners, it was that real drive to protect their workforce and on a human level, putting in place ways of talking to their people and make sure they're okay as they have to operate remotely or they go on furlough, or making sure their skills don't deplete as a result of not being in the factory. Disrupted supply channels, sales channels is definitely at the forefront, not just because of the Brexit side of things, but actually people had to buy things quickly as the supply chains got disrupted, and that's disrupted many other supply chains and sales routes as well. So it's important to kind of keeping close to your client was critical, and for those that didn't, unfortunately, there was a lot of disruption that took place. And data-driven decision-making has come out. People had to make decisions quickly. It was so tiring for you guys, making lots of decisions in quick succession and a lot of talk of exhaustion at a decision-making level. But what we do see is that data driving those decisions is where people turned. The demand for data massively increased. Ability to see performance by product, by geography, by location, by function, really drove this. And then again, the last point I got there is slightly worrying one. The number of businesses that disrupted how they operated quickly, but didn't necessarily backfill that quickly with appropriate mitigation through risk and governance. So decision-making chains became a lot shorter, but actually a lot of time and effort wasn't put into actually making sure mitigation went into the processes, and that raises real big concerns around things like quality and concerns around things like cyber and other forms of risk and fraud. So I would emphasize that one thing coming out is the need for businesses to go back through the decisions they made and just make sure that it hasn't caused any problems underneath inside their business. So just a few stories and from across the country of what we were seeing out there. Hopefully that just puts a few thoughts in mind for people as well in terms of the kind of things they should be thinking about. But aware of time, so Bal, I'll hand back to you at that point.
Brilliant, thank you everyone. We've had a couple of questions come through. One of them I feel like you've already covered, but the first one for James. How can we quickly kickstart green hydrogen generation with offshore wind?
Yeah, sure. I've consulted with our policy expert here at Make UK, who specialises in energy, so I can't claim to be a personal expert in this, but he's given me a very good insight to that question, which I'll feed through, which is, as such, the technology already exists and could be deployed very shortly. However, producing hydrogen through electrolysis, i.e. offshore wind to hydrogen, is still relatively very expensive to other ways. And this would not, in the current, how it stands, be very attractive to manufacturers at current price levels, unless it was heavily subsidized by government or otherwise. Initially, he says, we would therefore expect hydrogen to be produced by converting natural gas to hydrogen with carbon capture and storage technologies, which is about half the cost roughly, but it is still more expensive than natural gas. This would allow the UK to start blending hydrogen into the natural gas grid and start the overall conversion to hydrogen. And as we slowly increase the use of electrolysis, Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates that in 2050 it could be competitive with natural gas. And that being said, though, there may still be a case for offshore wind to hydrogen during the night when the grid demand is low. The government's expected to outline its hydrogen strategy in the Energy White Paper, which is planned to be launched in the autumn. The EU launched its hydrogen strategy earlier this year and are planning to install at least 6 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers by 2024, and ramping that up to 40 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers by 2030. And just for comparison, as of today, the UK probably has around 100 megawatts of electrolyzers to compare that with the EU's plans. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question.
Thanks, James. And the other question that's come through, like I say, I feel like we've touched on it, but I'll read it out. And if any of the panelists have something to share, please do. The data shows significant optimism for orders and output in Q4. However, the data also shows a stark increase in redundancies. Whilst this may result in capacity constraints, could it be the case that we are seeing measures being taken to rationalise workforces and improve productivity that needed to happen anyway, but which is triggered by COVID-19?
Shall I, James might want to give a more considered answer based on the economics. I think that we've talked here today about manufacturing as a single entity. And the reality is that's necessary for a kind of event like this, where we're talking about trends and themes and so on. But I do think, to answer the question, we probably need to look at it in much more of its constituent parts. I think that manufacturing and some sectors have had a productivity challenge for a long time. And I think probably candidly, while we also think about the kind of human cost of that and the jobs and so on, there are probably some areas where what this process is doing is highlighting some changes. Mark talked about, firms that have done things manually that they can change, and we've all talked about particular examples of things that are happening that have been, COVID has been a catalyst for. What I think is also the case, and this is where, we've had some really genuinely tragic stories of firms that have built up over a long period of time, that have had to make very sizable redundancies very quickly because demand has just fallen out of the market. And I think, the example I've got particularly in my mind is in the aviation sector. a company that makes servicing parts for Rolls-Royce engines. Planes aren't flying. There is no demand for servicing parts. That was a very healthy business. It was growing. It was expecting to recruit people over the next 18 months to 2 years. Had a fantastic investment in apprenticeship training and upskilling its workforce, preparing for the digital economy. And I don't think they would argue, nor would I, that this was, in some respects, a kind of COVID consequence that simply moved the redundancy program or moved some productivity improvements that would have been there anyway. So I think we have a real mixed picture. I certainly think that we can probably say that some of those losses, sad though they are, will fall into that category. But I think we've also got some very sizable examples where COVID and potentially in the future, the failure to do a trade deal with the EU, if that's where we end up, those I think will be changes that are driven directly by circumstance, and they wouldn't have happened otherwise. James, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Just a sort of colloquialism that we've developed in our own research in respect to this question is this sort of notion of lean by force, and we've been talking a lot about it within our team, which is that there will be, especially as I mentioned in my presentation earlier, as we see that output tick up and employment tick down, de facto what we're going to see is productivity improvement. If manufacturing businesses are managing to outpace their output or maintain it above their employment and their working hours, that productivity measure will improve. Now, whether it's the right or the wrong reasons is largely because they were forced to do it by COVID and the cash flow restrictions and having to cut their wage bill. But the real question is the sustainability of that, because it's well and good, and it's been a challenge for the UK manufacturing sector for years, decades even, to get that productivity up. But if it's not sustainable, and what I was sort of going on about the investment, the investment horizon not looking to match that output and orders expectation, we might see that spike in productivity through this lean by force principle not survive deep into 2022 or 2023, when there might be a slump if the fundamental underpinnings don't catch up to the short-term boost in orders and output with reduced staff counts.
Yeah, just picking up on James's point about, I suppose it falls into the camp of bad decision making. Actually, I think it's easy to knee-jerk respond and say, look, there's a chance to improve productivity. Is it sustainable or not? But actually, there's a lot of anecdotes of businesses making bad decisions as they've gone through this. So big encouragement is to go back to that data and check that you're actually looking at reliable information. So what people have got a little bit used to knee-jerk responding to their decision making as they've gone through COVID. And actually, it's really important that they go back to actual real data. Is it true? Is it profitable? Is it still contributing? Actually, is it productive? What are the causes of that lack of productivity? It's a little bit too easy sometimes just to assume that it might be that maybe the staff weren't as productive as wanted. So would massively encourage people to go back to facts. We've seen some terrible examples of businesses closing factories as an example, and then having to reopen them again just because they didn't have the right data in front of them. So encouragement to anyone out there to just make sure you've done your due diligence first before you make those decisions.